Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Sometimes that chance comes running through the mud, with tears in her eyes, begging for help. Rurik the Stoneborn had returned home after 20 years of raiding, ready to put down his sword and live quietly. The old Viking warrior was tired of war and blood. He wanted peace, but as he stepped off his longship, a small girl ran toward him crying. She was barefoot and desperate. Her tiny hands grabbed his arm as she looked up with breaking eyes. "Please," she whispered through her tears. "Please follow me home." Something deep inside the warrior's heart stirred. This child needed him. Against his better judgment, he followed her into the forest. What he found in that burned cottage would change his life forever. The girl's mother lay dead by the hearth. Her baby brother was starving. The village had abandoned them. Everyone had turned away from these forgotten children. Everyone, except Rurik. Why did this little girl choose a stranger to save her family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salt spray had long since dried from Rurik's weathered face, but he could still taste the brine on his lips as he stood on the familiar shoreline. 20 years. 20 long years since he had last seen these rocky cliffs, these towering pines that bent toward the sea, like old men offering prayers to the wind. The battle-worn cloak that hung from his broad shoulders told stories in every tear, every bloodstain that had refused to wash clean. It was wool dyed deep blue, once royal in its richness, now faded to the color of winter storms. The silver clasps that held it together were tarnished, beaten by countless campaigns across foreign seas. He pulled the cloak tighter against the autumn chill and surveyed the landscape that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. The village of Bjornstad lay just beyond the tree line, smoke rising from chimneys he remembered from his youth. But something felt different now. The very air seemed heavier, laden with an unspoken sorrow that made his warrior's instincts prickle with unease. Rurik had not planned to return a broken man. In his mind's eye, he had always imagined coming home victorious, his longship heavy with gold and glory, his men singing songs of their conquests. Instead, he stood alone on this desolate beach, the sole survivor of his last raid. The others, good men, brave men, lay buried beneath foreign soil or fed the fishes in waters far from home. Their faces visited him in his sleep, asking why he lived when they did not. The weight of his sword at his hip felt like an anchor now, dragging him down rather than lifting him up. How many men had fallen to its edge? How many mothers had wept for sons who would never return because of his blade? The numbers blurred together in his memory, a red haze of violence that had once made him feel powerful but now left him hollow. His hair, once golden as summer wheat, had turned the color of iron, shot through with silver threads that caught the dying light. His beard, braided with small bones and metal rings in the old way, hung heavy against his chest. The scars that crisscrossed his arms and torso were like a map of his violent past, each one a story he wished he could forget, but it was his eyes that carried the heaviest burden. They had seen too much, done too much. They were the pale blue of winter ice, cold and distant, as if he was looking at the world from behind a barrier that could never be crossed. The young men who had sailed with him often spoke of his death stare, the way he could look right through a man's soul and see the moment of his ending. It was a gift that had served him well in battle, but had cost him dearly in peace. The longship behind him groaned against its moorings, its dragon-headed prow staring blindly toward the sea. It had been his home for more years than he cared to count, its deck slick with the blood of enemies and friends alike. Now it felt like a tomb, a monument to a life he no longer wanted to live. He had already decided it would be his last vessel. After tonight, he would burn it in the old way and let the flames carry his warrior's spirit to whatever gods still listened to the prayers of killers. The path from the beach wound upward through dense forest. The same trail he had walked as a boy when the world seemed full of endless possibility. Back then, he had dreamed of glory, of songs that would be sung about his deeds long after his bones had turned to dust. He had gotten his wish, in a way. There were indeed songs about Rurik the Stoneborn, about the man who could not be killed, who stood alone against armies and emerged victorious. But the songs never mentioned the cost. They never spoke of the nights he lay awake, listening to the ghosts of the dead calling his name. His father's farm lay somewhere beyond these trees, or what remained of it. The old man had been dead for 15 years, according to the last message that had reached him across the water. His mother had followed 2 winters later, her heart finally giving out under the weight of grief for a son who had chosen the sword over the plough. He had inherited land he had never worked, a legacy he had abandoned for the promise of treasure and fame. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his life taking what belonged to others, and now he possessed nothing but memories he wished he could lose. The gold was gone, spent on wine and women whose faces had already faded from his memory. The fame had curdled into infamy. The glory had revealed itself to be nothing more than blood and sorrow dressed up in poetry. As he walked the ancient path, Rurik found himself remembering the boy he had been before the first raid, before the first kill, before he learned that a man could survive almost anything if he simply stopped caring about the consequences. That boy had believed in honor, in protecting the weak, in using strength to build rather than destroy. What would that boy think of the man he had become? The trees pressed close around him, their branches interlocking overhead like the ribs of some great beast. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of running water, a stream that had probably flowed unchanged since his childhood. The familiarity of it made his chest tight with an emotion he could not name. Homesickness seemed too small a word for the ache that had brought him back to this place. He had no plan beyond finding a quiet place to die. Perhaps he would rebuild his father's farmhouse, tend a small garden, and try to make peace with the ghosts that followed him. Perhaps he would simply walk into the forest one winter day and let the cold take him. Either way, his days of violence were over. His sword would rust in its sheath before he drew it again. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded him of better times. Soon the village would be settling down for the evening meal, families gathering around warm hearths to share the day's news and plan for tomorrow. It was a life he had never known, a peace he had never allowed himself to want. But as he walked deeper into the forest, Rurik began to sense that something was wrong. The woods were too quiet, the usual sounds of small animals and birds conspicuously absent. There was a smell in the air, faint but unmistakable to a man who had spent half his life on battlefields. It was the smell of death, of sorrow, of lives cut short before their time. His hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt, old habits asserting themselves despite his resolution to leave violence behind. Whatever waited for him in these familiar woods, he would face it as he had faced everything else, with steel in his spine and iron in his heart. But deep inside, in a place he had thought long dead, a small voice whispered that perhaps his journey home was not meant to end in peaceful retirement after all. The path curved ahead, disappearing into deeper shadow, and Rurik pressed forward into the growing darkness, unaware that his true destiny was about to come running toward him through the mud, with tears streaming down her face. The small figure that burst from the tree line moved with the desperate urgency of a hunted animal. Rurik's warrior instincts, honed by decades of combat, had him reaching for his sword before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. But as the child drew closer, stumbling over roots and stones in her haste, he let his hand fall away from the weapon. She was perhaps 7 summers old, though hunger and hardship had stolen the roundness from her cheeks that should have marked her age. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, hung in tangled knots around a face streaked with dirt and tears. Her feet were bare and bleeding, cut by stones and thorns in her headlong flight through the forest. The simple woolen dress she wore was torn and stained, hanging loose on her thin frame like a burial shroud. But it was her eyes that stopped Rurik's breath in his throat. They were the pale green of sea glass, wide with terror and pain that no child should ever know. In them, he saw a reflection of his own soul, desperate, abandoned, clinging to hope even as the world crumbled around them. When she looked up at him, those eyes held a question that cut deeper than any blade. "Will you save us when no one else will?" "Please," she gasped, her small hands grasping at his cloak with surprising strength. "Please, you have to come. She's gone cold and Bjorn won't stop crying, and I don't know what to do anymore." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, some lost to sobs, others so quiet he had to lean down to hear them. Her voice carried a particular quality of exhaustion that comes from screaming until there is nothing left, from crying until the tears run dry. Rurik had heard that tone before. On battlefields, where the wounded called for their mothers, in voices broken by pain, against every instinct that told him to walk away. To avoid whatever tragedy had befallen this child, Rurik found himself nodding. "Show me," he said simply. She turned and ran back into the forest, and he followed, his long strides easily keeping pace with her smaller steps. As they moved deeper into the woods, the smell he had noticed earlier grew stronger. It was not the clean scent of recent death, but something older, more lingering, something that spoke of suffering drawn out over days or weeks. The path she led him down was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and fallen branches. It was the kind of track that led to places forgotten by the world, where people went when they had nowhere else to turn. As they walked, Rurik noticed broken twigs and disturbed earth that told a story of frequent travel by small feet. This child had been making this journey many times, carrying whatever burdens a 7-year-old could manage. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by a cottage that had seen better days. Half of the structure had been blackened by fire, the roof partially collapsed and open to the sky. But the other half still stood, smoke rising weakly from a chimney that struggled to draw. It was the kind of dwelling that housed those who had fallen from grace, who existed on the edges of society's notice. The girl, he realized he didn't even know her name, pushed open the door and gestured for him to follow. The interior was dim, lit only by the dying embers of a fire that had been built with green wood and desperation. The air was thick with smoke and the sweet, cloying smell of death. Near the hearth, covered by a threadbare blanket, lay the still form of a woman. Even in death, Rurik could see that she had once been beautiful, with the same wheat-colored hair as her daughter and the delicate bone structure that spoke of noble blood. But hardship had carved deep lines around her eyes, and her lips were blue with the cold that had claimed her. Her hands, folded across her chest, were worn raw from work, the nails broken and bloody. Beside the woman's body sat a wooden loom, its frame partially charred by the fire that had claimed half the house. Stretched across it was the beginning of a tapestry, the threads forming what might have been a pattern of flowers, or perhaps stars. The work was delicate, skillful, the kind of craft that took years to master. But it would never be finished now. The shuttles lay scattered on the floor, and the bright wool had been singed by flying embers. The sight of that interrupted weaving hit Rurik harder than he expected. It spoke of dreams cut short, of a woman who had tried to create beauty, even as her world fell apart around her. How many evenings had she spent at this loom, working by firelight while her children slept, trying to weave together a future that would never come. But it was the sound from the corner that drew his attention next. A thin, weak crying that barely rose above a whisper. The girl led him to a pile of blankets where a baby boy lay, perhaps 2 years old, his face gaunt with hunger. His eyes were the same pale green as his sister's, but dulled by weakness and thirst. When he saw Rurik's unfamiliar face, he tried to shrink back into the blankets, but he lacked the strength even for fear. "This is Bjorn," the girl said, her voice steady now that she had brought help. "He's my brother. Mama told me to take care of him, but I don't know how. I tried to give him water, but he won't drink. I tried to feed him, but we don't have any food left." Rurik knelt beside the makeshift bed, his warrior's eyes taking in details that told a story more complete than any saga. The baby's lips were cracked and dry. His breathing was shallow, labored. His tiny hands clutched weakly at the air, searching for comfort that wasn't there. Without intervention, he would be dead within days, perhaps hours. "What's your name, child?" Rurik asked the girl, though part of him already suspected the answer. "Astrid," she replied. "Astrid Eriksdotter. My papa was Eric the Truth Speaker before—" Her voice broke off, and she looked away. Rurik knew that name. Eric had been a respected man in Bjornstad, a wealthy trader known for his honesty and fair dealing. But that had been 20 years ago. What had happened to bring his family to this place of desperation? As if reading his thoughts, Astrid continued in a small voice. "Papa went away last winter. Said he had to find work in the south, that he'd come back when the snows melted. But the snows melted and he never came. Then the sickness came and took most of the animals. Then the fire—" She gestured toward the burned half of the cottage. "Mama tried to put it out, but she breathed too much smoke. She's been getting weaker and weaker, and then 3 days ago she just stopped. 3 days. The woman had been dead for 3 days, while this child tried to care for her baby brother, alone." Rurik felt something twist in his chest, a pain he hadn't felt since his own childhood, when he had watched his grandfather waste away from a fever no healer could break. "The village," he began. But Astrid cut him off with a shake of her head. "They say we're cursed, that the gods are angry with our family. They won't come here anymore. They won't help." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she had accepted this abandonment as just another hardship to endure. Rurik stood slowly, his mind racing. This was not his responsibility. These were not his children. He had come home to find peace, not to take on the burden of caring for orphans. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away. Let the village elders deal with the situation. Let someone else take responsibility for these broken lives. But as he looked down at Astrid's upturned face, at the trust and hope shining in her sea-glass eyes, he knew he could not turn his back. Something in this child's desperate courage reminded him of the boy he had been before the world taught him that strength meant taking what you wanted rather than protecting what mattered. For 20 years, he had been Rurik the Stoneborn, the man who could not be killed, the raider who showed no mercy. But standing in this smoke-filled cottage, looking at 2 children who had no one else to turn to, he felt the stone around his heart beginning to crack. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Why did you come to me instead of someone else?" Astrid considered this for a moment, her young face serious. "Because you looked sad," she said finally. "Mama always said that sad people understand each other better than happy ones. And because—" She hesitated, then reached up to touch the silver pendant that hung from his neck, a hammer-shaped charm that marked him as a follower of Thor. "Because you wear the thunder god's sign, and Thor protects those who can't protect themselves." Out of the mouths of children. Rurik closed his eyes and felt 20 years of careful emotional armor crumble away like sand. This little girl had chosen him not because he was strong or fearsome, but because she recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who knew what it meant to be lost and alone. When he opened his eyes again, his decision was made. The first thing Rurik did was tend to the baby. His massive hands, more accustomed to wielding sword and axe, moved with surprising gentleness as he lifted the tiny boy from his nest of blankets. Bjorn was lighter than he should have been, his small body burning with fever, yet shivering with cold. The child's eyes, when they focused on Rurik's face, held a bewildered acceptance that cut the warrior deeper than any blade. "We need water," Rurik said to Astrid, who watched his every movement with the intense concentration of someone learning to trust again. "Clean water, not from the well if it's been tainted." "There's a spring," she said quickly, "up the hill past the old oak. Mama said it never runs foul." While Astrid fetched water in a cracked clay pitcher, Rurik examined the cottage more carefully. The half that hadn't burned was structurally sound, but barely adequate for shelter. The hearth drew poorly, filling the room with smoke. The roof leaked in 3 places, evidenced by water stains on the wooden floor. Most telling of all, there was no food anywhere, not even crumbs or bones to suggest a recent meal. When Astrid returned, Rurik dampened a piece of cloth and began to clean the baby's face and hands. Bjorn fussed weakly at first, then seemed to understand that this stranger meant no harm. Drop by drop, Rurik coaxed water between the child's cracked lips, patient as a man who had learned that survival often came down to such small, persistent acts. "Tell me about your father," Rurik said as he worked. The question served two purposes: to distract Astrid from her worry and to gather information about what had really happened to this family. Astrid settled beside him, close enough to help, but far enough away to flee if needed. Even in her trust, Rurik recognized the wariness of someone who had learned that adults could not always be counted upon. "Papa was the best trader in 3 villages," she said with obvious pride. "He never cheated anyone, never sold bad goods." The Jarls respected him. He had a big house in the village center, with glass windows and carved shutters. "We had servants and fine clothes and—" Her voice trailed off as she looked around the humble cottage. "What changed?" Rurik asked gently. "The bad harvest 2 summers ago. Papa had promised grain to the eastern settlements, but our fields produced almost nothing. He used his own stores to honor the contracts, said his word was worth more than gold. Then the wolves came and took most of our livestock. Papa sold everything, the house, the furniture, Mama's jewelry, to pay his debts. It was an old story, as common as winter following autumn. An honest man brought low by circumstances beyond his control, his very honesty becoming the instrument of his destruction. A less scrupulous trader would have simply declared the contracts void due to the poor harvest, but Eric, the truth speaker, had chosen honor over survival. "We moved here last spring," Astrid continued. "Papa said it was temporary, just until he could rebuild. He took what coin he had left and went south to buy goods for trading. Said he knew of a merchant who owed him a favor, someone who would give him fair terms, even though he had no collateral." Rurik felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He had a terrible suspicion about the fate of Eric, the truth speaker, but he kept his fears to himself. Instead, he focused on the baby, who had managed to swallow a few mouthfuls of water and was now resting more peacefully in his arms. It was then that Astrid showed him something that made his blood run cold. From beneath a loose floorboard, she pulled out a leather sheath, empty and still bearing the scent of well-oiled steel. "Papa's hunting knife," she said. "He never went anywhere without it. Said it belonged to his grandfather and would protect our family. But it was here when Mama got sick, just the sheath. The blade was gone. The hunting knife, or rather its absence, spoke volumes to a man who understood violence and its aftermath. Eric had not simply died in some southern port or fallen victim to bandits on the road. Someone had taken his blade, someone who knew its value and wanted to send a message. The missing weapon was a signature as clear as any written confession. Rurik studied the empty sheath, noting the fine craftsmanship and the worn spots where a man's hand had gripped it countless times. This had been more than a tool. It had been a symbol of Eric's protection of his family, his ability to provide and defend. Taking it was an act of deliberate cruelty, designed to strip away not just life, but dignity as well. "Astrid," he said carefully, "did anyone come looking for your father after he left? Anyone asking about debts or making threats?" The girl's face darkened. "Magnus Ironfoot came twice. Said Papa owed him money from a deal that went bad. Mama told him Papa was traveling, but Magnus said that was convenient. Said Papa was probably hiding from his responsibilities. Magnus Ironfoot, another name from Rurik's past, though not a pleasant one. Magnus had been a minor trader when Rurik left, known for sharp dealing and shadowy associations. If he had risen to the level where he could threaten a man like Eric, it suggested the village's power structure had shifted considerably in 20 years. "What did your mother tell him?" Rurik asked. "That Papa would settle all debts when he returned." Magnus laughed and said the dead don't pay debts. Mama got angry then and told him to leave. He did, but he looked at our house like he was already counting coins. Bjorn stirred in Rurik's arms, making soft sounds that might have been words in another few months. The baby's fever had broken and his breathing was stronger. Small victories, but they mattered. Each moment the child lived was another chance for something better to take root. As evening approached, Rurik faced a decision that would define everything that followed. He could not leave these children here alone, but taking them to the village would mean confronting whatever forces had destroyed their family. It would mean stepping back into a world of conflict and violence he had sworn to leave behind. But as he looked at Astrid's hopeful face and felt Bjorn's tiny hand curl around his finger, Rurik realized that some choices were not really choices at all. These children needed protection, and he was the only one standing between them and a world that had already shown them too much cruelty. "We'll need supplies," he said finally. "Food, medicine, warmer clothing for the boy," from the village. Astrid asked, and there was fear in her voice. "Yes, but not begging." Rurik's voice carried the edge of command that had once made hardened warriors snap to attention. "I have silver left from my travels, enough to buy what we need and perhaps more." He stood, settling Bjorn more securely in his arms. The baby looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than they should be, as if he somehow understood that his life had just taken a dramatic turn. "You would do that for us?" Astrid whispered. "Spend your own silver on strangers?" Rurik considered the question seriously. 3 days ago he would have said no without hesitation. 3 days ago he had been Rurik the Stoneborn, a man who took what he wanted and gave nothing back. But standing in this broken cottage, holding a child who trusted him completely, he felt the last of that old identity crumble away. "You're not strangers anymore," he said simply, as they prepared to leave the cottage. Astrid carefully wrapped her mother's body in the finest cloth they could find, whispering prayers in the old tongue. Rurik helped her gather what few possessions remained: a wooden doll with yarn hair, a small wooden horse carved with love and patience, a silver ring that had belonged to her grandmother. The walk to the village would take them past places where Rurik had played as a child, past farms where his friends had lived, past the meadow where he had first kissed a girl whose name he could no longer remember. He was about to return to Bjornstadt, not as the conquering hero he had once imagined, but as a protector of orphans. Carrying a baby and followed by a grieving child, it was not the homecoming he had planned, but as they stepped onto the path that led toward the village lights, Rurik found himself thinking that perhaps it was the homecoming he had needed all along. The village of Bjornstad had grown in Rurik's absence, but not in ways that spoke of prosperity. Where he remembered neat gardens and well-maintained buildings, he now saw structures patched with mismatched wood and roofs that sagged under the weight of too many hard winters. The main street, once bustling with traders and craftsmen, was nearly empty despite the early evening hour when families should have been gathering for their meals. As Rurik approached the village center with Bjorn in his arms and Astrid at his side, he became aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. Word of his return had already spread, as it always did in small communities, where strangers were rare and legends walked among mortals. He heard whispers following in his wake. Rurik the Stoneborn, the man who cannot die, 20 years of blood on his hands. The first test came at the well in the village square, where a group of women had gathered to draw water for the evening. They fell silent as Rurik approached, their eyes moving from his scarred face to the children he protected. One of them, a woman with graying hair and suspicious eyes, stepped forward with the authority of someone accustomed to speaking for others. "So the prodigal son returns," she said, her voice carrying across the square. "And with Eric's cursed children, no less. Some might wonder if there's a connection between your arrival and their misfortunes." Rurik recognized her now, Sigrid Ironhand, the blacksmith's widow and unofficial voice of village gossip. She had been middle-aged when he left. Now she carried herself with the rigid righteousness of someone who had survived by judging others more harshly than herself. "The children need food and medicine," Rurik said simply, his voice carrying none of the challenge that might have been expected from his reputation. "I have silver to pay fair prices. Silver earned how?" Sigrid's question carried the sharp edge of accusation. "Blood money from raids across the sea? Coin taken from honest folk who never did you harm?" Behind her, the other women nodded agreement, their faces set in the hard lines of people who had endured too many disappointments to trust easily. Rurik understood their suspicion. He had left as a young man hungry for glory and returned as a figure from their worst stories about what their sons might become if they chose the raiders' path. But it was Astrid who answered, her young voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of absolute truth. He found us when everyone else had given up. Mama's been dead for 3 days, and nobody came to help. Nobody brought food or medicine, or even asked if we were alive. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Rurik saw several of the women look away in shame. In the silence that followed, he heard the approaching footsteps of someone accustomed to command. Elder Gunnar approached with the measured pace of a man who had learned to conserve his strength for the battles that mattered. His staff, carved from ancient oak and topped with iron bands that marked his authority, tapped against the stone pavement with each step. He was older than Rurik remembered, his once powerful frame now bent with age. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him the village's leader for more than 30 years. The staff was more than a symbol. It was a repository of the village's history, carved with runes that told the stories of every major decision, every crisis weathered, every leader who had carried it before Gunnar. In its grain were the marks of countless meetings, the worn spots where hands had gripped it during difficult deliberations. It represented the community's collective wisdom, the authority to speak for the common good. But as Rurik looked at the staff now, he wondered if that authority had been used wisely in the case of Erik's family. Rurik Eriksson, Gunnar said, using the formal name that marked Rurik as the son of Erik Swordbreaker, not the fearsome title he had earned through violence. You have returned to us after many years away. I have, Rurik replied, matching the elder's formal tone. And I find the village much changed. Gunnar's eyes moved to the children, lingering on baby Bjorn, who had begun to fuss in Rurik's arms. These children have been a matter of concern for the village council. Their mother's death was a tragedy, but resources are limited. We had planned to send them to the sisters at the coastal monastery, the sisters who turn children into servants. Astrid spoke up, her voice sharp with fear. Who make them work in the fields until they're old enough to be married off to whoever pays the highest bride price. Rurik felt something cold settle in his chest. The monastery Gunnar referenced was indeed known for taking in orphans, but their reputation for treating such children well was questionable at best. It was a convenient solution for villagers that wanted to avoid the burden of caring for the abandoned, but it was hardly the fate any loving parent would choose for their children. The children will stay with me, Rurik said quietly. The words carried no threat, but there was a finality to them that made several people step back unconsciously. And who are you to make such decisions? This came from a new voice, one that carried the oiled smoothness of a man accustomed to getting his way through persuasion rather than force. Magnus Ironfoot stepped out of the shadows beside the inn, and Rurik's estimation of village politics immediately sharpened. Magnus had indeed prospered in the years since Rurik's departure. His clothes were fine wool trimmed with silver thread, his boots were supple leather that spoke of southern craftsmanship, and his belt carried a pouch that clinked with the weight of coins. But more telling than his wealth was the way other villagers deferred to him, stepping aside to give him room as if his presence commanded respect or fear. I am someone who remembers when this village cared for its own, Rurik replied. I am someone who wonders what has changed so much that orphaned children are seen as burdens rather than treasures to be protected. Magnus smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. Times change, old friend. The world has become a harder place since you left. Resources must be allocated carefully. The common good must come before individual sentiment. And who decides what serves the common good? Rurik asked. Those with the wisdom to see beyond immediate emotion, Magnus replied smoothly. Those who understand that sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater benefit of all. The words were reasonable, even wise-sounding, But Rurik heard the calculations beneath them. He recognized the voice of a man who had learned to dress his self-interest in the language of community concern. It was a skill he had seen many times in the various courts and councils he had encountered during his travels. "The children need immediate care," Rurik said, deliberately stepping away from the philosophical debate Magnus seemed to want. "Food, clean water, warm shelter. I'm prepared to purchase what they need." "Of course," Magnus said, his tone suggesting magnanimous agreement, "though I should mention that there are outstanding debts associated with the family." Eric made certain commitments before his departure. Honor would suggest those obligations should be settled before new resources are allocated. There it was, the trap Rurik had expected. Magnus was not just a successful trader. He was the village's new power broker, the man who decided which families prospered and which ones found themselves forgotten in burned cottages beyond the tree line. Astrid pressed closer to Rurik's side, and he felt her small hand slip into his free one. Her trust was absolute, but her fear of Magnus was equally clear. Whatever had happened to her family, she understood that this man had been at the center of it. "We can discuss debts later," Rurik said. "Tonight the children eat." "Indeed they shall," Elder Gunnar intervened, his staff tapping once against the stone with the finality of decision. "The inn will provide what is needed. Magnus, the village treasury will cover any immediate expenses." Magnus's smile flickered for just a moment, but he nodded graciously. "Of course, Elder. The children's welfare is paramount." As the crowd began to disperse, Rurik caught Gunnar's eye and saw something there that had not been present in the public exchange. A weariness, perhaps even a plea for understanding. The politics of Bjornstad had grown more complex during Rurik's absence, and the old man was caught between competing forces he might not be strong enough to control. But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, Rurik's responsibilities were simpler and more immediate. He needed to feed 2 hungry children, tend to a baby's fever, and begin the delicate work of building a life from the ruins of tragedy. As he followed Gunnar toward the inn, Astrid still holding his hand and Bjorn growing heavy in his arms, Rurik found himself thinking about the staff the elder carried, about the authority it represented, and the wisdom required to wield it justly. In his years of raiding, he had learned much about taking power by force. But standing in the village square where he had played as a child, surrounded by the tangled politics of home, he began to understand that protecting others might require a different kind of strength altogether. The inn's common room felt smaller than Rurik remembered, its low ceiling blackened by years of hearth smoke and its wooden tables worn smooth by countless elbows and ale cups. But it was warm, and that was what mattered most for the children who sat beside him on a bench near the fire. Astrid clutched a bowl of thick stew as if it might disappear, while Bjorn dozed in Rurik's lap, his fever finally broken and his breathing steady. The innkeeper, a round woman named Helga, whose husband had died in a fishing accident years before, moved about her business with the efficient kindness of someone who understood hardship. She had prepared the meal without question and asked for no payment up front, trusting in the traditional obligations of hospitality that still held some sway in Bjornstad. But Rurik was not naive about the other patrons. Several local men sat at nearby tables, their conversations carefully muted, but their glances frequent and measuring. They were taking his measure, trying to reconcile the legend of Rurik the Stoneborn with the man who sat gently feeding broth to an orphaned baby. The real test came when the door opened and a group of younger men entered, their faces flushed with ale already consumed elsewhere. Rurik recognized their type immediately. The sons of prosperous families who had never faced real hardship, who saw strength as something to be tested rather than respected. They moved with the swagger of men who believed themselves warriors without having earned the right to the title. Their leader was Olaf Magnusson, a broad-shouldered young man who wore his father's features and his father's calculating nature. He was perhaps 25 summers old, with the kind of easy confidence that came from never having failed at anything important. His sword was good steel but too clean, his armor well made but unmarked by battle. Everything about him spoke of privilege and position. Well, Olaf said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, the famous Rurik the Stoneborn playing nursemaid to cursed children. How the mighty have fallen. The common room went silent except for the crackling of the fire. Astrid pressed closer to Rurik's side, while Bjorn stirred restlessly in his arms. This was the moment Rurik had expected, the inevitable challenge that would establish his place in the village's new hierarchy. But instead of the explosive violence his reputation suggested, Rurik simply looked up from the baby and met Olaf's eyes, with the kind of calm that came from having nothing left to prove to anyone. "Olaf Magnus' son," he said quietly, "you've grown since I left. Your father must be proud." The words were neutral, even complimentary, but something in Rurik's tone made Olaf's companions shift uncomfortably. The young man had expected anger, perhaps violence, something that would allow him to prove himself against a legend. Instead, he faced the patient gaze of a man who had seen too much to be rattled by posturing. "Is it true what they say?" Olaf pressed, moving closer. "That you've killed 100 men? That you once held a bridge alone against an entire army?" "Stories grow in the telling," Rurik replied. "But yes, I've killed men. More than I care to count. And now you tend babies like a woman." The insult hung in the air, crude and deliberately provocative. Several of the older patrons looked uncomfortable, understanding that Olaf was walking a dangerous line. But Rurik only adjusted Bjorn's position in his arms and continued to meet the young man's gaze steadily. "Tell me, Olaf," Rurik said conversationally, "what do you think makes a man strong?" The question caught Olaf off guard. The ability to take what he wants, to defeat his enemies, to make others fear his name. Rurik nodded as if considering this seriously. "I thought that once. I spent 20 years proving I could kill anyone who challenged me, take anything I desired, make grown men wet themselves at the mention of my name. Do you know what it got me?" "Glory," Olaf said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Nightmares," Rurik corrected gently. "Sleepless nights listening to dead men call my name. Empty victories that turned to ash in my mouth before the blood had even dried. I learned that there's no honor in killing the weak, no strength in taking what others cannot defend." He stood slowly, careful not to wake the baby, and faced Olaf directly. The difference in their presence was striking. The young man's aggressive energy seeming suddenly juvenile beside Rurik's weathered calm. "But holding this child while his fever breaks," Rurik continued, "knowing that he lives because I chose to act rather than walk away, that requires more strength than any battle I've ever fought. Protecting those who cannot protect themselves, that's not the work of women, boy. That's the work of men." The silence that followed was profound. Even Olaf's companions had stopped their supportive murmuring, sensing that their leader had stumbled into waters deeper than he understood. The young man's face cycled through several emotions, anger, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of respect. It was Astrid who broke the tension, her clear voice cutting through the awkwardness with the directness that only children possessed. "Are you the one who took Papa's knife?" she asked Olaf, her green eyes steady and unafraid. The question hit the room like a physical blow. Conversation stopped entirely, and even the servants paused in their work. Olaf's face went through a range of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like guilt. "What knife?" he asked, but his voice lacked conviction. "Papa's hunting knife," Astrid continued relentlessly. "The one with the bone handle and the runes carved in the blade. The one that belonged to his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather. It's missing from its sheath." Rurik felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had assumed the missing knife was connected to Eric's death, but Astrid's direct challenge suggested she had specific reasons for suspecting Olaf. The girl was not making random accusations. She had seen something, heard something that connected this young man to her father's fate. "Child," Elder Gunnar's voice came from the doorway, where he had appeared with the silent approach of a man accustomed to moving carefully through dangerous situations. Such accusations should not be made lightly, but Astrid did not back down. It's not an accusation, Elder. It's a question. A simple question that should have a simple answer. Gunnar's ancient eyes moved from the girl to Olaf, and Rurik saw something there that might have been knowledge the old man wished he did not possess. The politics of Bjornstad were indeed more complex than they appeared on the surface. Perhaps, Gunnar said carefully, this conversation would be better continued in private. The inn is no place for such serious matters. No, Rurik said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had commanded others in life and death situations. The child has asked a reasonable question in public. It deserves a public answer. All eyes turned to Olaf, who stood frozen under the weight of scrutiny. His father's training in smooth words seemed to have deserted him, leaving only a young man who had perhaps gotten in deeper than he ever intended. He began, then stopped. His gaze flicked to the door, as if calculating whether he could simply leave. But Rurik's presence blocked that escape route. The knife, Astrid pressed, her voice still steady, but gaining strength from Rurik's support. Where is Papa's knife? The question hung in the air like smoke from the hearth, thick and choking. Whatever answer came next, Rurik knew it would change everything that followed. The comfortable fiction that Eric had simply died in some distant place. The polite pretense that his family's abandonment was merely unfortunate. All of it was about to crumble under the weight of a 7-year-old girl's uncompromising search for truth. And in that moment, looking at Astrid's determined face and feeling Bjorn's trusting weight in his arms, Rurik understood that his journey home had led him not to peace, but to a reckoning that was 20 years in the making. The answer, when it came, arrived not from Olaf's stammering lips, but from an unexpected source. Magnus Ironfoot stepped through the inn's doorway with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to controlling difficult situations. In his hand, he carried something that made Astrid gasp, and Rurik's blood turned to ice. It was Eric's hunting knife. The blade gleamed in the firelight, its steel unmarked by rust or neglect. The bone handle, carved with intricate knotwork patterns, showed the wear of generations of use. Most telling of all were the runes etched along the fuller, ancient symbols that marked this as more than a simple tool. This was a family heirloom, a link to ancestry and honor that no honest man would part with willingly. I believe this is what the child is asking about, Magnus said smoothly, setting the knife on the nearest table with the careful precision of a man making a point. Eric left it as collateral for a loan he took before his final journey. A desperate man's promise to return and settle his debts. The lie was beautifully constructed, delivered with just enough detail to sound plausible. Magnus had clearly prepared for this moment, probably the instant he realized Rurik had returned with the children. But lies, no matter how well crafted, carried their own weight, and Rurik had learned to feel the difference between truth and deception. "You're saying my father borrowed money from you?" Astrid's voice was small but steady, her young mind working through implications that would have challenged adults. "Business arrangements between grown men?" Magnus replied with paternal condescension. "Nothing a child would understand. Your father needed silver for his trading expedition. I provided it as any friend would with suitable guarantees. But Papa never borrowed money," Astrid said, her voice gaining strength. "He always said debt was a chain that bound a man's honor. He would rather starve than owe silver to anyone." Magnus's smile never wavered, but Rurik caught the flash of annoyance in his eyes. The man had not expected to be challenged by a child, certainly not one who knew her father's character so well. "Circumstances change us all," Magnus said. "Even the most principled men sometimes find themselves in positions where they must compromise their ideals." It was then that Rurik noticed something that made his warrior's instincts sharpen. Like a blade being drawn, the knife's edge showed no signs of use, no nicks or stains that would mark it as a working tool. But more significantly, there was a dark spot on the bone handle, a stain that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "May I?" Rurik asked, reaching for the knife with the casual authority of a man accustomed to examining weapons. Magnus hesitated for just a moment, but refusal would have seemed suspicious. He gestured graciously as if granting a favor. The moment Rurik's fingers closed around the handle, he knew the truth. The weight was wrong, not the balance he would expect from a blade that had been carefully maintained and regularly used. This knife had been cleaned recently, hastily, by someone more concerned with removing evidence than preserving the weapon's edge. But it was the smell that confirmed his worst suspicions. Beneath the sharp scent of cleaning oil lay something else, the metallic tang of blood that had soaked into bone and could never be completely removed. This blade had tasted death, and recently. Interesting craftsmanship, Rurik said conversationally, turning the knife to catch the light. The runes are particularly fine. Do you know what they say? Magnus's expression remained carefully neutral. Old symbols, decorative mostly. Actually, they're a binding oath, Rurik continued, his voice carrying the tone of a man sharing interesting but harmless information. They translate roughly to, by my hand and my honor, I protect what is mine. It's the kind of inscription a man would have carved to mark his commitment to his family. He paused, letting the significance of the words settle over the room like morning mist. The kind of inscription that would make it very difficult for an honorable man to willingly give up the blade, even as collateral for a loan. The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken accusations. Magnus's composure finally showed cracks, tiny fissures in his carefully maintained facade. Olaf looked between his father and Rurik with growing unease, as if sensing currents he did not fully understand. Perhaps, Elder Gunnar said carefully, we should discuss this matter in the council hall, where such serious questions can be properly addressed. But Astrid was not finished. With the relentless logic that only children possessed, she pressed forward with questions that cut through adult evasions, like a sharp blade through cloth. If Papa left the knife as collateral, she said, why didn't he take it back when he returned from his journey? He never returned, Magnus replied, but there was a note of strain in his voice now. But he did return, Astrid insisted. I saw him 3 nights before Mama got too sick to stand. He came to the cottage after dark, but he didn't stay long. He was frightened of something. He kept looking over his shoulder, like someone was following him. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Magnus went very still, his merchant's mask slipping entirely for just a moment to reveal something cold and calculating beneath. Olaf's face went pale as the implications of his sister's words became clear. Child, Magnus said, his voice carrying a warning edge, grief can play tricks on memory. In your sorrow you may have dreamed. I didn't dream it, Astrid cut him off with the absolute certainty of truth. He brought me a carved bird, see? From her small pouch she pulled a tiny wooden figure no bigger than her thumb. It was expertly crafted, showing the skill of someone who worked with wood for pleasure rather than necessity. He said he was sorry he couldn't stay, but there were men looking for him. Bad men who wanted to hurt our family. Rurik examined the carving, noting the fresh wood shavings still caught in the intricate details. This had been made recently, probably during the long days of a trading journey when a father's thoughts turned to the children he had left behind. He told me to hide if strangers came, Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the truth she had been carrying alone. He said to take Bjorn and hide in the root cellar if anyone came asking questions about him. He said, her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. He said he loved us, but he had done something that might bring danger to our door. The words fell into silence so complete that the crackling of the fire seemed unnaturally loud. Magnus stood frozen, probably calculating how much damage this child's testimony could do to carefully laid plans. Olaf looked sick, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in ways he had never wanted to see. But it was Elder Gunnar who spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of authority and the burden of knowledge long suppressed. Magnus, he said quietly, I think it's time we had that private conversation after all. The staff in the old man's hands seemed heavier now, its carved symbols catching the firelight like accusatory eyes. The artifact that represented the village's collective wisdom was about to be brought to bear on secrets that had festered in darkness for too long. Magnus looked around the room, perhaps seeking allies or escape routes, but finding neither. The other patrons watched with the fascination of people witnessing a reckoning they had sensed was coming, but had been powerless to prevent. "Of course, Elder," Magnus said finally, his voice regaining some of its smoothness, "though I hardly see what a child's confused memories have to do with legitimate business arrangements." But Rurik was no longer listening to Magnus's protestations. He was watching Astrid, seeing the strength that had kept her and her brother alive when the entire village had turned its back on them. This child had not only witnessed her father's final visit, she had understood its significance and kept it secret through days of grief and abandonment. She was braver than most warriors he had known, and certainly braver than the men who had let her family suffer while protecting their own comfortable lives. As the group prepared to move to the council hall, Rurik handed the knife back to Magnus with deliberate care, but not before he had committed every detail to memory. The weight, the balance, the way the blood had stained the bone, despite someone's careful cleaning. "An interesting blade," he said mildly. "I look forward to learning more about its history." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Magnus might control the village's politics and commerce, but Rurik understood violence and its aftermath in ways that 20 years of soft living could never erase. Whatever had happened to Eric the Truth Speaker, whatever secrets lay buried beneath the village's prosperous facade, they were about to be dragged into the light, and as they walked toward the council hall, Astrid's small hand secure in his, Rurik found himself thinking that perhaps his sword would not rust in its sheath after all. The council hall had not changed much in 20 years, its high-beamed ceiling still dark with smoke from countless meetings where the village's fate had been decided. Ancient weapons hung on the walls, swords and shields from battles long forgotten, their steel now serving as reminders of honor rather than instruments of war. At the hall's center sat a massive oak table, scarred by decades of hard use, where Elder Gunnar now placed his staff with ceremonial gravity. But it was what happened next that changed everything Rurik thought he understood about Bjornstad's corruption. Elder Gunnar did not take his customary seat at the table's head. Instead, he moved to one of the wall niches and withdrew something that made everyone in the room draw sharp breaths. It was a scroll case, ancient and sealed with wax, that bore the mark of the king's authority. The kind of document that could condemn or absolve, that carried the weight of royal justice behind its words. 23 years ago, Gunnar began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official pronouncement. This village received a charter from King Harald Bluetooth himself. A charter that granted us certain rights and protections in exchange for a very specific obligation. He broke the seal with deliberate ceremony and unrolled the parchment, its surface covered with the careful script of royal scribes. The words were in Latin as well as Norse, marking this as a document of the highest importance. "We were designated as a sanctuary village," Gunnar continued, "a place where those who had served the crown faithfully could find refuge when their service made them enemies. Political refugees, former spies, men who had carried out the king's will in ways that made them targets for revenge." Magnus went very still, his face assuming the careful neutrality of a man hearing information he had hoped would never be revealed. But Olaf looked genuinely confused, clearly learning this history for the first time. The charter promised that such refugees would be given new identities, new lives, protection from their pasts. In exchange, they would use their skills to serve the village's interests, trading connections, information networks, knowledge of distant markets and political situations. Rurik felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. "You're saying Eric was not who he claimed to be?" Eric Eriksson was indeed a trader, Gunnar confirmed. But before that, he was Oswald the Sharp-Tongue, one of King Harald's most trusted information gatherers, a man who had penetrated the courts of 3 enemy jarls and brought back intelligence that prevented at least 2 wars. The revelation recontextualized everything. Eric's reputation for honesty in trade, his knowledge of distant markets, his careful way of speaking that suggested education beyond what a simple merchant would possess. All of it made sense now. "He came to us 15 years ago," Gunnar continued, "fleeing the consequences of his final mission. He had exposed a conspiracy among the Eastern Jarls, but in doing so, he had made enemies who would never stop hunting him. We gave him a new identity, a new life. He married Sigrid Thorsdottir, had children, built the reputation that made him one of our most respected citizens." Astrid pressed closer to Rurik's side, her young mind struggling to process this transformation of everything she had believed about her father. Bjorn stirred restlessly in Rurik's arms, perhaps sensing the tension that filled the room like smoke. "But sanctuaries can be compromised," Elder Gunnar said, his eyes fixed on Magnus with the weight of accusation. "Especially when someone with access to sensitive information decides that silver matters more than honor." Magnus finally found his voice, though it carried none of its usual smoothness. "You cannot seriously be suggesting—" "I am not suggesting anything." Gunnar cut him off with the authority of a man who had run out of patience for comfortable lies. "I'm stating facts that can be proven. 3 months ago, a messenger arrived from the Eastern Territories. He carried inquiries about a man matching Eric's description, offering substantial rewards for information about his whereabouts. The scroll case contained more than one document," Rurik realized as Gunnar withdrew a second parchment. This one bore different seals, darker stains, the look of something that had traveled far and been handled by many unfriendly hands. The messenger spoke privately with several villagers. Gunnar continued. "Most honored our obligations and said nothing. But someone provided information. Someone told the messenger exactly where to find the man they were seeking, and that someone was Magnus," Rurik said. "It was not a question. The evidence suggests so," Gunnar replied carefully. "Though proving it has been difficult. Magnus is careful, and his position in the village makes direct accusation dangerous." "This is madness," Magnus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You would take the word of ancient documents over the service I have provided this village? I've brought prosperity, trade connections, wealth that has benefited everyone. Wealth built on betraying those we swore to protect," Gunnar said quietly. "Prosperity purchased with the blood of a man who trusted us to keep him safe." It was then that the final piece of the puzzle revealed itself. From the depths of the scroll case, Gunnar withdrew something that made Magnus step backward as if struck. It was a letter written in Eric's careful hand, bearing the date of 3 months past. "Eric suspected he had been betrayed," Gunnar said. "He wrote this letter and gave it to me for safekeeping in case something happened to him. It details his growing certainty that someone in the village had revealed his location to his enemies. It names Magnus Ironfoot specifically as the most likely suspect. The letter was Eric's final testimony, his last act of defiance against the forces that had finally tracked him down." As Gunnar read selected passages aloud, a picture emerged of a man who had realized his sanctuary was compromised, but had been powerless to escape without abandoning his family. "He came to me 2 weeks before his final journey," Gunnar continued. "He knew his enemies were closing in, but he also knew that running would only make things worse for his wife and children. So he made a different choice. The scroll case yielded one final document, a travel pass bearing Eric's true name and sealed with his own signet ring. The kind of document that would allow safe passage through enemy territory, but only if the bearer was willing to surrender himself to the justice of those he had wronged. He went south not to trade," Gunnar said, his voice heavy with the weight of truth long suppressed, "but to surrender himself to his enemies. He hoped that by giving them what they wanted, his life, they would leave his family in peace." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Astrid's quiet sobs, as she finally understood what had really happened to her father. He had not died in some distant accident or fallen victim to random bandits. He had walked knowingly into death to protect the children who now looked to Rurik for salvation. But they killed him anyway, Rurik said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who understood the brutal mathematics of revenge. And then they came back for the family, to make sure there were no loose ends. The fire, Magnus whispered, his face gone pale as the full scope of his actions became clear. The sickness that took the animals. Those weren't accidents. No, Gunnar confirmed. They were warnings. Messages intended to drive the family from the village before more direct action became necessary. When Eric's wife and children refused to leave, when they tried to maintain their place in the community, you let it happen, Rurik finished, his voice carrying a note of steel that made everyone in the room step back unconsciously. You all knew what was happening, and you let a woman and her children suffer because it was easier than honoring your obligations. The transformation in Rurik was subtle but unmistakable. The weary, peace-seeking exile was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The man who had spent 20 years earning a reputation for ruthless efficiency was remembering why that reputation had been necessary. But it was Astrid who spoke the words that cut deepest. Her young voice carrying the moral clarity that adults so often lost in their calculations of advantage and survival. Papa died to save us, she said, her tears streaming freely now. And you let the bad men hurt us anyway. You let Mama die alone. You would have let Bjorn starve. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, impossible to ignore or explain away. Magnus stood frozen, perhaps finally understanding the full consequences of his choices. Olaf looked sick, as if seeing his father clearly for the first time. Elder Gunnar placed the documents back in their case with the careful movements of a man handling something precious and dangerous. The scroll case itself was the true artifact of this chapter, a repository of truth that had been hidden away until courage and necessity brought it into the light. The question now, Gunnar said quietly, is what justice looks like for crimes that cannot be undone. But as Rurik looked down at the children who had trusted him to make everything right, he knew that justice would not come from village councils or ancient documents. It would come from the decision he made in the next few moments, whether to walk away from this tangled web of betrayal and corruption, or to see it through to whatever bloody conclusion awaited. The scroll case sat on the table between them, its contents having transformed everything they thought they knew about honor, loyalty, and the price of peace. And in its revelation, Rurik understood that his journey home had led him not to rest, but to the most important battle of his life. The dawn that followed the revelation in the council hall brought no peace to Bjornstad. Word of Magnus's betrayal had spread through the village like wildfire, carried by those who had witnessed the confrontation and embellished by those who had not. By the time the sun cleared the eastern mountains, the entire community was divided into factions, those who demanded immediate justice, those who feared the consequences of opposing Magnus's wealth and influence, and those who simply wanted the whole matter to disappear. Rurik stood at the window of the room Elder Gunnar had provided for him and the children, watching the village wake to its crisis. Astrid sat at the small table behind him, carefully feeding porridge to Bjorn while humming a lullaby their mother had sung. The sight of her trying to maintain normalcy in the face of such revelations made something twist in Rurik's chest. The knock at the door came as he expected it would, firm but respectful. He opened it to find Gunnar standing in the hallway, his ancient face creased with worry lines that seemed to have deepened overnight. "We need to talk," the elder said simply. They walked to Gunnar's private chamber, leaving Astrid to tend her brother under the watchful eye of Helga, the innkeeper. The room was sparse but comfortable, its walls lined with scrolls and ledgers that spoke of decades spent managing the village's affairs. On the desk sat a piece of parchment that had not been there the night before. "It arrived an hour ago," Gunnar said, gesturing to the document. Carried by a rider who left immediately after delivering it, Rurik examined the parchment, noting the quality of the paper and the formal script that marked it as coming from someone with education and authority. The seal was unfamiliar but elaborate, suggesting noble rank. "What does it say?" he asked. "It's from Jarl Thorvald Bloodaxe," Gunnar replied, his voice heavy with implications. "One of the Eastern Jarls who originally sought Eric's death. He congratulates Magnus on his assistance in bringing a traitor to justice and promises additional compensation for any remaining loose ends." The meaning was clear enough. Eric's enemies knew about his family and expected Magnus to complete the work of eliminating any potential witnesses or sources of future trouble. The children were still in danger, perhaps more so now that their father's true identity had been revealed. "How many people know about this message?" Rurik asked. "Only myself and the rider who delivered it. But Magnus will be expecting some kind of response. When none comes, or when the wrong kind comes, he'll realize his position is compromised," Rurik finished. "And desperate men make dangerous choices," Gunnar nodded grimly. "Magnus has built his prosperity on a foundation of carefully managed secrets and strategic betrayals. If that foundation crumbles, he'll drag down anyone he can reach in the collapse." The strategic situation was becoming clearer to Rurik's military mind. Magnus could not allow the truth of his betrayal to spread beyond Bjornstad, which meant he had to either control the narrative completely or eliminate those who could contradict it. With the children as witnesses and Gunnar as keeper of the damning documents, Magnus faced a choice between exile and escalation. "What forces can he command?" Rurik asked. "A dozen men, perhaps more. His own household guards, plus some of the younger villagers who owe him debts or favors. Olaf leads them, though I suspect the boy's stomach for violence may be weaker than his father believes." "And what forces stand with you?" Gunnar's silence was answer enough. The elder commanded respect and moral authority, but those were poor weapons against steel and desperation. Most of the village would choose pragmatic neutrality over principled resistance, especially when the cost of defiance might be their own lives or livelihoods. "You're asking me to fight," Rurik said. "It was not a question. I'm asking you to protect those children," Gunnar replied. "Everything else is your choice to make." The distinction mattered. Rurik had sworn to himself that his days of violence were over, but protecting innocence was different from seeking conquest or glory. It was the kind of battle that his younger self, the boy, who had believed in honor before the world taught him the cost of idealism, would have embraced without hesitation. But 20 years of warfare had taught him to count costs as well as causes. Even if he could defeat Magnus and his men, what then? The Eastern Jarls would eventually learn that their loose ends remained untied. They would send more men, better armed and less concerned with maintaining the pretense of legality. The cycle of violence would continue until either the children were dead or Rurik was. "There's another option," Gunnar said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "The royal charter that designated us as a sanctuary village also included provisions for extreme circumstances. If the sanctuary is compromised, if those we've sworn to protect are in immediate danger, we can request direct intervention from the crown." He withdrew yet another document from his desk, this one bearing seals and ribbons that marked it as a formal petition to royal authority. The parchment was already prepared, lacking only signatures and the specific details of the request. "You're talking about civil war," Rurik said, understanding the implications immediately. The Eastern Jarls against the crown, with Bjornstad as the battleground, perhaps. Or perhaps the Jarls will back down when faced with royal displeasure. They're ambitious, not suicidal. But either way, it would take weeks for such a petition to reach the king, and longer still for any response to arrive, time we may not have. Exactly. The conversation was interrupted by urgent footsteps in the hallway outside. A young man burst through the door without bothering to knock, one of the villagers Rurik remembered from childhood, now grown but still carrying the earnest intensity that had marked him as a boy. "Elder," he gasped, "Magnus is gathering his men. They're armed and moving toward the inn." Rurik felt the familiar calm that always preceded violence settle over him like a well-worn cloak. His hand moved instinctively to check his sword's position, muscle memory asserting itself despite his peaceful intentions. How many? he asked. 15, maybe 20. Olaf's leading them, but Magnus is giving the orders. The numbers were manageable for a man of Rurik's skills, but not with children to protect and innocent villagers likely to be caught in any fighting. This was exactly the kind of situation that demanded surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. "Is there another way out of the inn?" Rurik asked Gunnar. "The kitchen leads to an alley that connects to the old market road. But it only delays the confrontation. It doesn't resolve it." Rurik nodded, his mind already working through tactical possibilities. He had faced worse odds, in more difficult terrain, but never with so much at stake beyond his own survival. The children's safety had to be his primary concern, which meant avoiding a direct confrontation if possible. "I need you to do something for me," he said to Gunnar. "Take that petition to the king and sign it. Include everything, the betrayal, the murdered spy, the threats against innocent children. Make it official. And you? I'm going to buy us the time we need for royal justice to arrive." The plan that formed in Rurik's mind was risky but elegant in its simplicity. Instead of waiting for Magnus to force a confrontation on his terms, Rurik would seize the initiative and create a situation where the merchant's superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage. But first, he had to ensure the children's safety. Whatever happened next, Astrid and Bjorn could not be anywhere near the violence that was about to unfold. As they prepared to leave Gunnar's chamber, the elder grasped Rurik's arm with surprising strength. "The boy you were when you left here," Gunnar said quietly. "He would be proud of the man you've become." "The boy I was when I left believed he could solve everything with a sword," Rurik replied. "The man I am now knows better. And yet you're about to take up that sword again, not for glory this time, not for gold or reputation or the songs men will sing. This time, it's for something that matters." The distinction was important, though Rurik suspected it would matter little to the men who would try to kill him in the hours to come. But it mattered to him, and perhaps that was enough. As they walked back toward the inn where armed men were gathering to settle accounts written in blood and betrayal, Rurik found himself thinking about the wooden bird Eric had carved for his daughter in his final days. A small thing, simple and beautiful, created by a father's love in the face of approaching doom. It was the kind of legacy worth fighting for. The kind of inheritance that justified taking up the sword one last time. Not to destroy, but to protect. Not to conquer, but to preserve something precious and fragile in a world that seemed determined to crush it. The climax was coming, and Rurik the Stoneborn was ready. The confrontation began not with the clash of steel, but with the sound of splintering wood as Magnus's men kicked in the inn's front door. Rurik had expected this. The merchant's impatience and fear would drive him to direct action rather than subtle maneuvering. What he had not expected was the artifact that Magnus carried with him into the common room. It was Elder Gunnar's staff, the ancient symbol of village authority, now gripped in Magnus's fist like a club. The sight of it sent a chill through the gathered villagers who had come to witness the confrontation. Magnus had not simply defied the elder's authority. He had physically seized it, crossing a line that transformed political disagreement into open rebellion. "Where are they?" Magnus demanded, his merchant's composure finally cracking to reveal the desperate man beneath. His fine clothes were disheveled, his usually perfect hair wild with sweat and fear. The staff shook in his grip. Whether from rage or terror, Rurik could not tell. Helga the innkeeper stood behind her counter with the stubborn courage of a woman defending her own hearth. "If you mean the children, they're under my protection. And if you mean to harm them, you'll have to go through me first." "Stand aside, woman," Olaf said, though his voice lacked the conviction his father's situation demanded. The young man's sword was drawn but held uncertainly, as if he was not entirely sure he was prepared to use it. It was then that Rurik stepped into view, descending the stairs with the measured pace of a man who controlled both the timing and the terms of the encounter. He wore his mail shirt, the rings bright with recent cleaning, and his sword hung at his side with the casual accessibility of long practice. But more importantly, He carried something that made Magnus's eyes widen with recognition and fear. It was a horn, carved from the tusk of some great sea beast and bound with silver wire. This was no common drinking horn or simple instrument. It was a war horn, the kind carried by men who commanded others in battle, whose call could summon allies from great distances. Magnus Ironfoot, Rurik said, his voice carrying easily through the common room. You hold something that doesn't belong to you. This staff represents the authority of Bjornstad, Magnus replied, though his voice shook slightly. Authority that has been compromised by sentiment and outdated loyalties. That staff represents the collective wisdom of generations. It belongs to the community, not to any individual who thinks he can seize power through violence. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 20 armed men facing one warrior in a common room, filled with the tension of impending violence. Rurik could feel the weight of calculation pressing down on everyone present. Magnus, trying to decide if the risk was worth the potential reward. His men wondering if they had signed up for more than they had bargained for. It was Astrid who broke the deadlock, appearing at the top of the stairs with Bjorn in her arms and speaking with the clear voice of absolute moral authority. That's Elder Gunnar's staff, she said, her young eyes fixed on Magnus with unwavering accusation. You have no right to it. Just like you had no right to sell my papa to his enemies. The words cut through the room's tension like a blade through cloth, stripping away the pretense and political maneuvering to reveal the ugly truth at the heart of the conflict. Child, Magnus began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone adults used when they wanted to dismiss inconvenient truths. Oh, you don't understand the complexities. I understand that you killed my papa, Astrid interrupted, her voice growing stronger. I understand that you let Mama die alone. Each accusation hit the room like a physical blow, and Rurik saw several of Magnus's men shift uncomfortably. These were not hardened killers. They were villagers who had been drawn into a conflict they did not fully understand. Before the confrontation could escalate further, the sound that changed everything echoed across the village. It was another horn, deeper and more resonant than the one Rurik carried, coming from the direction of the harbour. Through the inn's windows, they could see the crimson sail of a royal longship rounding the headland, its dragon prow cutting through the morning waves with purposeful speed. You think the king will save you, Magnus hissed, his voice carrying the edge of complete desperation. You think royal justice will protect children whose father was a spy and a traitor? The words carried enough truth to make Rurik's blood run cold. Royal justice was not always the same as moral justice, and the king might well decide that sacrificing 2 orphan children was an acceptable price for maintaining peace with powerful jarls. Olaf! Magnus called to his son, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had built their family's fortune. Take your men and secure the children. Now! For a moment Olaf hesitated, looking between his father's desperate face and the moral weight of what was being asked. But family loyalty won out over personal conscience. With visible reluctance, he gestured for his men to advance. It was then that Rurik made his choice. The horn fell from his hand as he drew his sword in one smooth motion, the steel singing as it cleared the sheath. 20 years of peaceful intentions evaporated in the face of an immediate threat to the children he had sworn to protect. Stand down, he said quietly, but his voice carried the absolute authority of a man who had commanded others in life and death situations. No one touches the children. The transformation was immediate and startling. The weary exile disappeared, replaced by Rurik the Stoneborn, the man whose name had once struck fear into the hearts of enemies across the northern seas. His stance shifted into the balanced poise of a master swordsman, his eyes taking on the cold calculation that had made him legendary. The first attack came from the left, a young villager who had probably never faced real violence in his life. Rurik's response was economical and devastating. A simple parry that turned the attacker's momentum against him. sending him crashing into a table with enough force to end his involvement in the fight. The sight of their companion's swift defeat gave the others pause, creating the moment of hesitation that experienced fighters learned to exploit. Rurik used it to position himself better, his back to the wall and the stairs to his left, a defensive position that would force his opponents to attack him in small groups. 3 men came at Rurik simultaneously, trying to use their numbers to overwhelm his superior skill. But the inn's layout worked against them. The narrow space between tables and benches broke up their coordinated assault, forcing them to approach in a ragged line that Rurik could handle one at a time. His swordwork was precise and controlled, designed to disable rather than kill. A cut to the sword arm here, a pommel strike to the temple there, movements that spoke of a man who had learned that ending lives was sometimes necessary, but never something to be done lightly. It was then that the inn's front door burst open again. But this time, it was not Magnus's reinforcements who entered. 6 royal marines in polished mail and crimson cloaks flooded into the common room, their captain carrying something that made everyone freeze in recognition. It was a royal warrant, its purple wax seal bearing the personal mark of King Harold Bluetooth himself. The document that would decide not just this battle, but the fate of everyone involved in the conspiracy that had led to Eric's death. By order of His Majesty, the captain announced in a voice that carried absolute authority, all persons present will lay down their weapons and submit to royal judgment. The effect was instantaneous. Magnus's men, already demoralized by their inability to overcome a single opponent, dropped their swords with visible relief. Even Olaf seemed grateful for the excuse to step back from violence he had never truly wanted to commit. But Magnus himself was not finished. With the wild desperation of a man who had lost everything, he lunged not at Rurik, but toward the stairs where Astrid still stood holding her baby brother. "If I'm going to hang for treason," he snarled, "I'm taking the witnesses with me." The knife in his hand was small but deadly, aimed at the child who had spoken truth when comfortable lies would have served everyone better. It was an act of pure malice, the final revelation of what lay beneath the merchant's civilized facade. Rurik moved without conscious thought, 20 years of combat instinct driving him across the room in 3 swift strides. His sword swept up in an arc that caught Magnus's wrist, sending the knife spinning away harmlessly. The merchant fell to his knees, clutching his wounded hand. "It's over," Rurik said quietly, lowering his sword but not sheathing it. "Whatever game you've been playing, whatever debts you thought you could settle with blood, it's finished." The royal captain stepped forward, the warrant still in his hand. "Magnus Ironfoot, you stand accused of violating the royal charter, of betraying a man under crown protection, and of threatening the lives of innocent children. You will answer for these crimes before the king's justice." As the Marines moved to secure Magnus and his remaining supporters, Rurik finally allowed himself to breathe. The immediate danger was over. The children were safe, and royal authority would ensure that justice was done according to law, rather than the brutal mathematics of revenge. Elder Gunnar approached slowly, bending to retrieve his staff from where it lay abandoned on the floor. "It's finished," he said simply. "This part is," Rurik agreed, looking down at the children who had trusted him to make everything right. "But there will be consequences, questions that need answers, changes that can't be avoided." The staff was more than just a symbol of authority. It was a repository of the village's collective memory, a reminder that communities survived through their commitment to protecting each other. In Magnus's hands it had been a weapon. In Gunnar's, it was what it had always been meant to be, a tool for building rather than destroying. The climax was over, but the story was not yet finished. There would be trials and testimonies, the long work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by betrayal. But for now, it was enough that 2 orphaned children were safe, that justice would be done, and that a community had remembered what it meant to protect those who could not protect themselves. 3 months later, Rurik stood in the doorway of what had once been Eric the Truth Speaker's burned cottage. Watching Astrid and Bjorn play in the garden, where their mother's loom had been carefully buried beneath a flowering apple tree. The cottage itself had been rebuilt, its walls straight and strong, its roof tight against the autumn rain that drummed steadily on the new thatch. The transformation of the place mirrored the changes that had swept through Bjornstad following the king's justice. Magnus Ironfoot had been executed for treason, his properties seized and redistributed among those he had wronged. Olaf, shown mercy due to his youth and obvious reluctance, had been sentenced to 5 years of service in the royal guard, a punishment that might yet prove to be his salvation. But the most profound changes were not in laws or punishments, but in the quiet restoration of bonds that had been severed by fear and greed. The artifact that sat on the cottage's new mantelpiece told the story better than any words could. It was a wooden box, simple but beautifully crafted, containing the personal effects that had been returned to Eric's children after the investigation concluded. His knife had been cleaned and properly sharpened, its edge once again suitable for honest work, rather than bearing witness to violence. The carved wooden bird he had made for Astrid in his final days rested beside letters he had written, but never sent. Love poems to his wife, and a small silver ring that had belonged to his mother. Most precious of all was a journal, written in Eric's careful hand, that documented not just his work as a royal agent, but his transformation into a father and husband. The final entries, written during those desperate weeks when he knew his enemies were closing in, spoke not of regret for his past choices, but of gratitude for the love he had found in his new life. Astrid approached the box each evening before sleep, not to mourn what was lost, but to remember what remained. Her father's courage, her mother's love, the bonds of family that death could not break. She was still only 7 summers old, but she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had faced the worst the world could offer and emerged unbroken. Bjorn, now a healthy toddler with bright eyes and his sister's determined spirit, had no memory of the hunger and sickness that had nearly claimed him. But in his ready smile and fearless exploration of his new world, there was evidence of healing that went deeper than physical recovery. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Rurik's attention from his contemplation. Elder Gunnar emerged from the tree line, his staff tapping against the stone path that led to the cottage. The old man moved more slowly than he once had, the events of the past months having aged him visibly, but there was a lightness in his bearing that spoke of burdens finally lifted. The children look well, Gunnar observed, settling onto the wooden bench that Rurik had built beside the cottage door. They are well, Rurik replied. Better than well, considering what they've endured. And their guardian, how does he fare? The question carried layers of meaning. In the aftermath of Magnus's trial, the king had formally appointed Rurik as the children's protector, granting him both the authority and the resources necessary to ensure their safety. But more than that, the appointment had given him something he had not expected to find in his homecoming, a purpose that had nothing to do with violence or conquest. I find myself busier than I expected, Rurik said with the hint of a smile. Who knew that raising children required more strategy than commanding armies? Different kind of warfare, Gunnar agreed, but perhaps more important battles to win. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Astrid teach her brother to stack stones into small towers that he delighted in knocking down. The simple joy of their play was a reminder of what had been preserved through all the pain and struggle, the possibility of innocence, the chance for new beginnings, the promise that the future might be better than the past. I've had word from the capital, Gunnar said eventually. The king has decided to renew Bjornstad's charter as a sanctuary village. There will be changes, new oversight, but the essential mission will continue. And who will oversee these changes? Rurik asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Someone with experience in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Someone who understands both the cost of betrayal and the value of loyalty. Gunnar's eyes held a question that had been building for weeks. The position comes with significant authority, substantial resources, and the backing of royal law. The offer was tempting, and Rurik understood its significance. But as he watched Astrid carefully show Bjorn how to choose the right stones for their towers, he realized that his answer had been clear from the moment a desperate child had grabbed his arm and begged him to follow her home. "I already have a position," he said quietly. "One that matters more than any title or authority the king could grant." Gunnar nodded, as if he had expected this response. "The children will need education, training, preparation for the lives they'll choose when they come of age." Astrid shows signs of her father's intelligence, and Bjorn, well, he has the look of a child who will grow into strength. "They'll have whatever they need," Rurik promised. "And they'll have the choice to become whatever they wish to be. Traders like their father, scholars, craftsmen, or even warriors if that's their calling. But they'll never have to face the world alone." As the afternoon faded into evening, as the children tired of their games and came inside for the warmth of the hearth and the comfort of the bedtime stories Rurik had learned to tell, the old warrior found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this place. He had come home, seeking an ending, a quiet place to lay down his sword and fade into peaceful obscurity. Instead, he had found a beginning, not just for himself, but for two children whose futures had been rescued from tragedy by the simple act of choosing to care. The wooden box on the mantelpiece caught the firelight, its contents representing not just the memory of the dead, but the continuing story of the living. Eric, the truth speaker, had died to protect his children, but his sacrifice had meaning only because someone had been willing to finish what he started, to ensure that love and courage triumphed over greed and betrayal. Outside, the autumn rain continued its steady rhythm against the cottage walls. But inside, there was warmth and safety, and the quiet contentment that comes from knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new possibilities. Astrid and Bjorn were asleep in their beds, secure in the knowledge that they were protected and loved. Elder Gunnar had returned to the village, carrying with him the assurance that Bjornstad's future would be built on firmer foundations than its recent past. And Rurik the Stoneborn, once a terror of the northern seas, sat by the fire in a humble cottage and understood that he had finally found the peace he had been seeking. Not in the absence of responsibility, but in the embrace of it. Not in walking away from the world's pain, but in standing against it with whatever strength he possessed. The sword that hung above the hearth would rust if not properly maintained. But Rurik knew now that some weapons were meant to be preserved not for conquest, but for protection. Some battles were worth fighting, not for glory, but for love. And some stories had their true beginning not in the pursuit of fame, but in the moment when a stranger chose to answer a child's desperate plea for help. Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. Sometimes that chance comes running through the mud with tears in her eyes, begging for help. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you find the courage to say yes.